A Nightmare on Elm Street, Dreamspawn, by Krista Faust. Prologue. The girl lay wide-eyed in the dark, covers pulled up just below her eyes, waiting for the monster. She was 7, a big girl now, and she knew things that other kids in school did not seem to understand. They all thought that closing the closet door or having a nightlight could keep the monster away. They didn't know the monster like she did. It was not some scaly fairy tale beast with big teeth and claws. That was make-believe for babies. The real monster was liquid, transparent, and smelled like floor cleaner. It lived in a bottle, and when it went inside her daddy, it transformed him from a regular person into a monster more terrifying than any movie. A vicious, inhuman creature with wet, red eyes and poisonous breath. When her daddy was just her daddy, he was small, pale, and shaky in the harsh morning sun. But at night, when he was the monster, he was 10 feet tall and strong as a bear, ready to punish her for even the smallest mistake. Of course, the girl was always bad. She couldn't help it. She had been born that way. The thing that she had between her legs was proof that she was bad. That's why the monster had to hurt her. It was the only way to make her good. Her mom was bad too, because of that same thing. Only there was no hope for her because she was too old. According to the monster, ugly black hair grew on you when you got too old, proving that you were so bad that there could be no saving you. The girl had made the stupid mistake of pointing out that the monster had hair all over him, even more than her mother, and the cigarette burns he put on her legs that night as a consequence were still infected, oozing and refusing to heal. She would never make that mistake again. The girl shifted in her narrow bed, exposing her nose and sniffing gently. The stink from pepper was almost gone now. Or maybe she was just getting used to it. It had been 2 weeks since the monster had found out about Pepper and been forced to punish the girl to teach her a lesson. Pepper was a dog that had been living in the alley behind their apartment building. He was small and skinny, with long black fur and a funny, curious face like a little fruit bat. The girl had been sneaking him food for a few days, and he was starting to trust her, wagging his stumpy tail whenever he saw her. But she was not allowed to have a pet, and when the monster found out about it, about her giving some stray mutt their food, the food that he worked his fingers to the bone to provide for his family, he was furious. He dragged the girl out in the back alley and made her watch closely while he used a hot dog to trick Pepper into coming over to him. She stood there frozen, wanting to scream, to tell Pepper to run away, but unable to make a sound. All she could do was watch while Pepper's little black nose wrinkled and twitched, smelling the hot dog and creeping forward with big, hopeful eyes. "Come on over here, you little shit," the monster said in a sweet, sugary voice. "Come on and take the last bite of my food that you're ever gonna get." The girl clamped a hand over her mouth, whispering, "No, no, 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 no," behind clenched teeth. She watched in horror as Pepper reached out his snout to take the hot dog from the monster's hand, and the monster grabbed him by his scruff quick as a snake. Terrified and shaking, the little dog licked the monster's hand, and the monster laughed and picked up a brick. The girl turned away and jammed her fingers in her ears, but the sound of the little dog screaming in pain cut right through her, and the silence that followed was somehow a million times worse. "See what you did?" the monster asked, waving the loose and bloody body of the little dog in her face. "He would still be alive if he'd never met you. Think about that next time you want to give my food away to worthless fucking strays." For the first few days after the monster put Pepper's broken body under the girl's bed, as a reminder of her crime, she thought she was going to puke from the smell. By the weekend, her room was full of flies, bumbling against the window and landing on her while she tried to do her homework. She could not sleep, and she was terrified to look under the bed and see what was happening to Pepper. She became convinced that he hated her for making the monster notice him, and that he was going to come crawling out one night, all rotten and full of worms and ready to rip her throat out. Maybe she did deserve it. But he did not come, and the smell was fading, losing its teeth. The girl had to sniff hard to catch the threads of that thick, garbagey sweet stench. In a strange way, it was like Pepper was really finally gone. She was going to miss him. He had been her only friend. It was getting later and later, and the monster did not come. Her mom was on the couch, fast asleep from her injection, and the monster was home, but the girl didn't know where. She had heard him crashing through the living room about an hour ago, but nothing since. She lay there, listening with her whole body, but all she could hear was the low, mindless murmur of the television. Then she thought she heard something else, a kind of wet, ragged panting. It sounded like it was coming from under the bed. Terrified and unable to move a muscle, she heard a clicking shuffle and then a soft whine. She felt the tug of a small paw scratching at the edge of the blanket. "Go away, Pepper," she whispered, refusing to look over the edge of the bed. "Go away before he sees you." Again that soft tug, then suddenly Pepper was up on the end of the bed, sitting there with his head tilted and looking totally normal, just like he did the first day she saw him. "Get out of here," the girl said, her heart pounding in her chest. "If he sees you in here, he'll kill us both." Pepper opened his jaws wide, abnormally wide, like a crocodile, and a soft, whispery voice came out from deep inside his unmoving mouth. "You're dreaming," Pepper said. She looked around her familiar room, and everything was suddenly wrong and different. The wall with the door on it seemed a mile away, but the one with the windows was close enough to touch from her bed. Her bed seemed impossibly tall, taller than a bunk bed, but the ceiling was so high above her that it disappeared into shadow. She could still hear the TV, canned laughter from some sitcom, and the flickering light from the screen lapped under the cracks beneath the distant door. She wanted to call out, but knew her mom was impossible to wake when she had taken her medicine, and she was mostly useless even when she was awake. Not only that, but calling out might wake the monster. At the end of the bed, Pepper was licking his paw. All of his toenails were black, but the one on the paw he was licking were silvery white and dripping with dark blood. They grew longer and longer, splitting the puffy, irritated skin of his toes, and he looked up at her with blood drooling from his jaws. She thought for a second that maybe he was going to attack her after all, but instead he turned and jumped down off the bed. When she looked over the edge, the bed had returned to its normal height. Pepper looked back over his shoulder at her. He was as big as a Great Dane now, bulky and hunched like a gorilla, as he pushed the door open with his bloody paw. She scrambled out of bed to silently follow him, careful to avoid stepping on the smeary red paw prints as she made her way down the long, narrow hallway. The little girl came out into the living room. Pepper was crouched by the sofa where her mother lay, oblivious in the flickering, phosphorescent wash of the television. He sat on his haunches with his head low and the one bloody paw up like he wanted to shake her mother. She made a soft, blurry noise in her sleep and rolled over. The girl took a step closer, and Pepper raised that paw above his head. Only now it wasn't a paw, but a hand. A person's hand wearing some kind of weird homemade glove with long, shiny knives like claws. Pepper wasn't Pepper either. He was a man in a bulky black fur coat, hunkered down beside her mother. He stood slowly, letting the fur coat slither down off his shoulders and drop to the floor. It hit with a wet smack, sending a scattering of greasy white worms bouncing across the stained carpet. The man turned towards the girl, and when she saw his face, she sucked in a shocked little whimper, clapping her hand over her mouth. He was burned. There was a kid in her class who had a burn on his leg where some hot oil fell on him, and this man was like that all over, even his face. He had no hair on his head, and there were more of those horrible worms clinging to the rough, dirty weave of his Christmas-colored sweater. He smiled at her and motioned for her to come closer. Her muscles felt weak and sludgy from fear, but she had learned long ago what happened when you dawdled and did not do as you were told right away. So she forced her reluctant legs to scoot a little crooked sidestep closer to this strange and awful man. She watched him as he picked up her mother's medicine needle off the coffee table, pinching it between two fingers of his gloveless hand as if it were something nasty like a bug. He bent down over her mother, almost like he was going to kiss her or tell her a secret. Instead, he reached out and gripped her lower lip between two knuckles of the knife hand and stretched it out and down. Her mother made a hazy, incoherent protest that ratcheted up into a choking scream when the man jammed the needle up through the meat of her lip. She struggled and flailed as he hauled her to her feet, steering her with the needle. He turned her to the face of the girl and laughed, pulling her mother's lip out even further, and then slicing through the stretched skin with the knife tip of his index finger. Her mother staggered back, crashing into the television and spraying the screen with blood. The man handed the needle to the girl. There was a chunk of meat about the size of an Oreo cookie impaled on the end. She did not want to touch it, but her body did as she was told, just like she had been trained to do without any help from her brain. Standing there holding the grisly token, the girl watched the ugly man casually walk across the room to where her mother was crawling towards the door. She turned back and saw him and started trying to crawl faster. The girl could see the whole row of her long, yellowy lower teeth, all the way down to the bleeding gums where her lip had been torn away. The man planted his foot in the center of her mother's back and gripped a handful of her dirty, bleached hair, yanking her head up and back. She screamed and screamed, but then her scream melted into a hissing gurgle as the man drew his knife fingers across her throat. She flailed on the floor for a while, knocking things off shelves and thumping her head against the wall, and then finally, she was still. The girl could not take her eyes off her mother's crumpled body. The skinny, blue-white arms and legs, the lank, bleached blonde hair, the stained pink t-shirt, and lacy underpants. Everything about her, the same as always, now she was dead, just like Pepper. Never ever going to do anything else ever again. It was disgusting and scary, but the girl could not seem to feel sad or sorry. It was like something on the television in some faraway country. She just felt cold and numb. "One down!" the man said in a cheerful tone, shaking dust off a brown, old-fashioned hat and setting it on his head. "One down," the girl repeated in a whisper, finally able to look away from her mother's corpse and into the face of the ugly man. He gestured with his chin down the hallway toward her parents' bedroom, raising the corrugated flesh above his eyes where a regular person would have eyebrows. The big bedroom, the monster's lair. Her eyes went wide. "We can't go in there," she whispered, urgently shaking her head. "It's not allowed." The ugly man smiled indulgently and started down the hall. Icy terror flooded her body, and any other thought vanished from her head. The big bedroom was totally off limits. She had never been inside, but she made the mistake of knocking on the door once to tell the monster that his friend was waiting outside with her mother's medicine. After that, she had to miss a whole week of school until the swelling went down and her bruises healed. She ran after the ugly man and grabbed his arm. "Please," she begged. "You don't understand. You can't go in there while the monster's sleeping. He'll kill us." He laughed and shook her off like a cute but irritating puppy. Her fear was huge and suffocating as he reached out and turned the knob. There was no way to make the ugly man understand the terrible mistake he was making. It was like watching one of the little kids from the nursery school play with matches in a big puddle of gasoline. The girl had been burned by that particular gasoline so many times that her body knew the pain more intimately than her own heartbeat. She wanted to run away, but she was rooted to the hallway carpet, paralyzed by the totality of her fear. She was afraid to even look inside the forbidden room. She thought of that awful story of Bluebeard's wife. But the temptation was overpowering, and she craned her neck to see through the open door while the ugly man slipped inside as if it were no big deal. The room was filled with piles of dirty clothing, crusted plates and trays from frozen dinners. The smell was awful. Stale sweat and old vomit, and most of all that bad monster smell from all those empty and half-empty bottles. And there was the monster laying on the edge of the bed with his legs dangling over the side. He had one motorcycle boot on and one off, and his jeans were down around his ankles, exposing his saggy underpants. There was sticky yellow puke on his shirt, and he was snoring softly. The ugly man was standing by the side of the bed, holding a nearly full bottle. He gave the girl a conspiratorial wink and held the bottle high, as if he were about to drop it. Was he crazy? Suicidal? Every nerve in her body was screaming for her to run and hide, but she was frozen to the spot. She watched in slow motion, horror, while the bottle dropped, clear liquid spilling out as it tumbled down and shattered noisily on the floor. The monster sat up, wild-eyed and awake, reaching for his gun on the bedside table. Fear gripped the girl with seizure-like intensity, and she wet herself like a baby, barely even feeling it in the overwhelming panic that surged through her body. She covered her mouth with both hands. "Oops!" the ugly man said, throwing up his hands in mock distress. The monster pointed the gun right at the center of the ugly man's chest. "Who the fuck are you?" "Relax," the ugly man said. "It's just a dream." Almost too fast for her eye to follow, The ugly man grabbed the monster's hand, wrenching it up and away. The gun went off, the sound huge and deafening in the tiny room, and the overhead light fixtures shattered, raining broken glass down all around them. The ugly man slashed at the monster, opening deep, hungry-looking gashes in the muscle of the monster's forearm. The monster howled and dropped the gun. Together, the monster and the ugly man grappled and fought, rolling over and over across the bed and down onto the floor. The girl felt like she was screaming, but no sound came out. The ugly man kept on cutting into the monster over and over, his arms, his face, his chest, and blood sprayed across the front of the girl's damp nightgown, a taste of salt and pennies on her lips. She dropped her hands to her sides as a stunning realization started creeping over her. The monster was losing. He was fighting hard, but he was getting slower and slower, and every time he hit the ugly man, the man just shook it off and laughed, slicing some other place on the monster's body as if it were a game. The ugly man sliced deep into the monster's fat belly, and thick purple loops like raw, wet sausages started pushing out between the monster's desperate fingers. The girl's paralysis snapped, and she ran over to where the monster lay, gasping in a puddle of foul, bloody sewage and bile. She elbowed the ugly man aside and kicked the monster in the arm. "That's what you get!" she screamed in a kind of delirious ecstasy. "That's what you get!" She kicked him again. "When you are bad!" The monster reached a shaking, blood-slick hand towards her. His eyes were huge and terrified, and all the monstrousness seemed to drain away while she watched, until it was just her daddy, laying there dying. Then his eyes went dull, and a long, slow breath slipped out of him, and he wasn't anybody anymore. In the chaotic madness of her conflicting emotions, the girl had almost forgotten about the ugly man. When he put a hand on her shoulder, she screamed and flung herself against the wall, crouching down with her arms wrapped around herself. The ugly man squatted down until he was on her level, and took her face between his knife-blade fingers and his thumb, forcing her to look up at him. She felt the blade sink into her left cheek, and blood ran down her face like tears. She could smell him, a horrible, dirty barbecue grill smell mixed with fresh blood, and under it all a deep, rotten stench just like pepper. She was amazed to realize that she was not really scared anymore, just tired. "Are you the new monster?" she asked. The ugly man shook his head. "I'm here to set you free," he said. He let go of her face and pushed a sweaty lock of hair back behind her ear, then cocked his knife hand back. It made sense to her now. They were all bad, and it was the ugly man's job to kill them. She was just as bad as the monster, maybe worse. It was her fault that Pepper had to die, and even though she tried so hard to learn, she just couldn't stop herself from being bad. It was better that she die now before it was too late to save her. She closed her eyes and waited. But the cut never came. The knives never slid into the waiting flesh of her neck. Instead, she heard the distant scream of sirens getting louder and louder, and when she opened her eyes, the ugly man was gone. Policemen came. Deep, grown-up voices echoed through the house, but the girl couldn't make any sense of what they were saying. A tall, soft-spoken black guy wiped the cuts on her face with stingy stuff, took her pulse, and asked her if she was okay. He was gentle and nice, and the girl wanted to answer him, but her voice was gone. A policeman kept on asking her who did this to her, but the nice man told him to leave her alone. When they tried to take her out of the house, she screamed and fought. Didn't they understand that the ugly man was coming back for her, to set her free? How could he find her if she got taken away to some hospital? She was sure the nice man would understand if only she could find her voice. But all she could do was scream. Then the nice man gave her a needle just like her mother's, and everything melted away into blackness. Okay, this has been the prologue of A Nightmare on Elm Street Dreamspawn, a little taste of what's to come. I'm only going to do one book at a time, so every day until this book is finished, I will be dropping 2 to 3 chapters of it. Krista Foss seems like a pretty good writer. The prologue was written well. I'm curious to see where it goes. If this little girl is going to be the main character and stuff like that. Maybe even help Freddy at some point, I don't know. It seemed that way. The kill count for tonight is we've got a piece of shit father who got what was coming to him. and a druggy mom who never raised a finger to help her daughter, who got what was coming to her. Set free, whatever you want to say, I enjoyed it. Let me know what you think so far in the comments. If you're excited about this book, please subscribe if you haven't done so already. Click that like button, guys. It lets me know that you appreciate what I'm doing. Also, click the bell so you always know when new updates are coming, when new chapters are dropping, when giveaways are happening, when the winner has been drawn for these giveaways, everything like that. Okay, guys, until next time, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying thanks for listening and pleasant dreams!